The sun hung low over the jagged horizon, painting the desert in a wash of blood orange and violet that seemed almost unnatural in its beauty. The wind swept across the dry plains like a restless spirit, carrying dust and the distant cries of coyotes. In the midst of this harsh landscape, a solitary figure stood, his silhouette framed against the dying light. He was known across 3 counties as Golden Gun, a man whose name was whispered in saloons, feared in homesteads, and envied by every gunslinger who had the misfortune of meeting him. Golden Gun was a paradox, handsome yet haunted, ruthless yet bound by a strange code of honor that few could ever understand. His reputation was built on a combination of skill, luck, and sheer audacity. A gunfight with him was less a contest and more a spectacle of fate, and today, he had a challenge that would be remembered for years in every town from the Red Rock mesas to the snow-capped mountains. A duel at sunset, one-on-one for reasons only he fully grasped, and yet, across the dusty street, leaning casually against a weathered wooden post, stood the old cowboy. His face was a map of every hardship he had survived, lines etched deep from decades of sun, wind, and loss. His hands, calloused and strong, rested near his worn revolver. But there was no fear in his stance. The old cowboy had seen every kind of deceit, betrayal, and tragedy the West could conjure. Most importantly, he understood the value of life, the weight of choices, and the silent poetry of waiting for the right moment. The townsfolk had gathered, drawn by curiosity and the promise of violence, murmuring and shifting nervously. The saloon doors clanged in the distance as if to mark the countdown of fate itself. Even the horses seemed uneasy, stamping in the dirt, nostrils flaring as if they could sense the tension crackling like wildfire. Golden Gun's lips curled in a cold, arrogant smile. "I'll give you my golden gun if you survive the duel," he called, his voice cutting through the stillness. The words hung heavy in the air, a tantalizing promise for anyone daring enough to test him. The crowd gasped, some in awe, some in fear, but all in anticipation. The old cowboy's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in quiet calculation. He did not flinch. He did not raise his weapon. He simply waited, letting Golden Gun's bravado hang over him like a storm cloud ready to break. There was more at play here than pride or money. This was about respect, survival, and the invisible threads of destiny that only the Old West could weave. Minutes stretched into eternity. Golden Gun's fingers twitched near the grip of his prized revolver, a glint of metal catching the last rays of sun. His heart pounded, not from fear but from excitement. He had always thrived on the edge, and today, he had convinced himself that he could best the one man who had never lost a duel, never broken his own code, and never let desperation cloud his judgment. The old cowboy spoke softly, almost as if sharing a secret with the wind itself. "You think you own the horizon, son? But out here, the land decides who lives and the heart decides who survives." The words were simple, but each carried the weight of decades. Golden Gun's grin faltered slightly. It was the first crack in his unshakable confidence. Then, as if the world held its breath, the wind shifted, blowing dust into Golden Gun's eyes. A horse whinnied in the distance. A vulture circled overhead. And in that heartbeat of distraction, the old cowboy moved. Not fast, but impossibly precise. His hand hovered over his revolver, and in a motion so fluid it seemed like part of the wind itself. He was ready. Golden Gun blinked, confused by the sudden calm after the chaos. He realized too late that duels were not only about speed, but about patience, understanding the land, the silence, and the human heart. The old cowboy surprised him, not with a shot, but with a smile, gentle, knowing, and unyielding. It was a warning wrapped in wisdom, a reminder that legends were not built on arrogance, but on understanding. And just as the first star appeared in the twilight sky, Golden Gun felt it, a shift in the tide, the realization that he was not in control. He had challenged a man who had survived more than bullets. He had survived life itself. In that instant, every boast, every threat, every story he had told himself unraveled. The duel had not yet begun, and yet the outcome was already written in the eyes of the old cowboy, who stood calmly, unshaken by the heat, the dust, or the promise of gold. The townsfolk exhaled collectively, sensing a tale that would be told for generations, a tale of courage, cunning, and the strange poetry of survival in the unforgiving West. As night fell and shadows deepened across the empty street, Golden Gun knew he was about to learn a lesson that no amount of bullets, bravado, or golden revolvers could ever teach. In the Wild West, it was not the gun that decided life or death. It was the heart. the patience and the quiet power of those who had truly endured. And so, the stage was set, the duel looming like a storm over the horizon, and the first chapter of an unforgettable story of survival, respect, and the unexpected bonds that form in the most dangerous of places came to life. The night settled over the town like a velvet cloak, soft and deceptive, hiding the dangers that roamed the streets in the shadows. Lanterns flickered in the windows of shuttered homes, and the occasional howl of a coyote echoed through the empty alleys. The old cowboy remained on the main street, his silhouette bathed in the dim glow of the last gas lamps, calm as a mountain standing against a storm. Golden Gun, meanwhile, had retreated a few steps, pacing just enough to shake off the tension coiling in his shoulders, yet not enough to appear uncertain to the crowd that had now gathered silently in the dark. It was rare for the Old West to see a duel that transcended mere bravado. Most ended with a bang, a scream, and a body dragged into the dust, never remembered beyond the local gossip. But this was different. Golden Gun could feel it in his gut. The old cowboy's presence was not merely physical. It carried the weight of decades of hardship. Every battle fought in silence, every loss absorbed without complaint. Each line on his face told a story of survival, of love lost and found, of nights spent under cold stars with nothing but a blanket and a prayer. The townsfolk sensed it too. They had come expecting spectacle. They were witnessing legend. Golden Gun's thoughts churned like a storm in his mind. He had always believed that skill with a gun could overcome anything. He had faced outlaws, renegades, and desperate men, and had emerged victorious every single time. Yet now, with the old cowboy waiting calmly across from him, the rules felt different. Speed alone would not win this duel. Cunning alone would not suffice. It would take understanding, patience, and the courage to admit one's own limitations. Golden Gun realized, with a mixture of frustration and awe, that he was about to be tested in a way he had never imagined. He remembered the stories he had heard in distant saloons, the tales of the old cowboy riding through blizzards that should have killed a man twice over, tracking criminals across barren deserts and saving lives without ever asking for thanks. There was a quiet ferocity about him, a way of moving that made him seem both everywhere and nowhere at once. And now here he was, standing under the same twilight sky, ready to challenge a man whose life had been a series of impossible victories. The old cowboy's voice broke the silence, low and steady, carrying across the empty street. "You're young, son, full of fire and arrogance. That fire will serve you well, but it will also blind you if you let it. You think this duel is about the gun, but it's about more than that. It's about knowing what you're willing to risk, and what you're willing to lose." His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Golden Gun's. For a moment, Golden Gun felt exposed, as if every lie he had told himself about his own invincibility was being stripped away in the cool night air. Then, as if to punctuate his warning, a sudden gust of wind swept across the street, sending dust swirling and rattling shutters along the buildings. A tumbleweed rolled lazily between the two men, a silent observer of the tension that stretched taut like a drawn bowstring. The townsfolk shifted, holding their collective breath, sensing the invisible line between life and death that now divided the street. Golden Gun's hand twitched toward his revolver, but he stopped himself. The old cowboy was not reacting in kind, not pulling a gun, not drawing, not flinching. It was a calculated silence, the kind that came from decades of experience. Golden Gun realized that to rush forward now would be to surrender to his own impatience. Instead, he let his eyes sweep over the old cowboy's stance, the calm precision of his movements, the way the faint moonlight highlighted the scar crossing his left cheek, a scar that spoke of a battle long ago, a battle won not with speed but with patience. Time seemed to stretch. Each heartbeat echoed like a drum in Golden Gun's chest. He thought of the golden revolver promised in his boast, a weapon he had flaunted like a crown, and yet now it felt meaningless. Survival, he realized, was more important than any prize. The old cowboy understood that better than anyone. Every man in the crowd could feel it, the lesson that life on the frontier was not about glory, but about respect, cunning, and the quiet strength to endure. And then, breaking the tension, the old cowboy smiled faintly, not a mocking smile, nor one born of cruelty, but one of recognition. Recognition that the young gunslinger had courage, but also room to grow. "You want this duel," he said softly. "But do you understand what it really means? It's not the shot you fire that decides your fate. It's the choices you make before you even reach for the gun. Golden Gun swallowed hard. He had never faced words like these before. Words heavier than lead, sharper than any bullet. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down, an invisible hand guiding him toward an understanding he could not yet articulate. The duel, he realized, was no longer a contest of speed or skill. It was a crucible, a test of character, patience, and heart. The wind shifted again, colder now, carrying the faint scent of sage and desert flowers. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a mournful sound that seemed almost like a warning. Golden Gun steadied his breathing, trying to reconcile his desire for victory with the unfamiliar, unnerving respect he now felt for the old cowboy. For the first time, he wondered if he was truly ready for what the frontier demanded, not just of a gunslinger, but of a man. And as the first chill of night settled deep into the bones of the town, both men remained poised, waiting. The duel had not yet begun, but its lessons were already unfolding. The old cowboy stood like a sentinel of the past, a living reminder that the Wild West did not reward arrogance or haste, but wisdom, resilience, and the courage to face not just one's enemies, but oneself. In the shadows of the lanterns, the townsfolk whispered among themselves, sensing the birth of a story that would be told long after the guns had been holstered and the dust had settled. A story of survival, of respect, and of the strange, unbreakable bond between the young and the experienced, between fire and patience, between life and legend. The night had deepened into an almost tangible darkness, stretching across the town like a thick, suffocating blanket. Lanterns flickered and guttered in the wind, their light dancing over the uneven boards of the saloon, the shuttered windows, and the rough-hewn facades of the general store and blacksmith shop. The air smelled of dust, smoke, and the faint tang of horses and leather, carrying with it the weight of history and hardship that clung to the frontier. Somewhere a dog barked, and in the distance, the cry of an owl cut sharply through the silence. A lonely sentinel observing the unfolding drama on the main street. Golden Gun stood, restless, feeling the adrenaline and tension coiling in his chest like a living thing. He had faced impossible odds before, faced men whose reputations were forged in blood and desperation, and yet nothing had prepared him for the presence of the old cowboy. It was not fear exactly. He was too proud for fear, but it was a strange gnawing unease. The old cowboy's calmness, his unhurried breathing, and the quiet strength in his stance carried a gravity that made Golden Gun acutely aware of his own youth, inexperience, and untested patience. The townsfolk lingered at the edges of the street, their faces pale and anxious yet captivated. Mothers held children close, and the blacksmith leaned against his post, hammer abandoned, watching intently. No one moved, no one spoke, as if even breathing too loudly might shatter the delicate tension that hung between the two men. It was a duel unlike any the West had seen. Not one of impulsive rage or prideful posturing, but a clash of wits, patience, and soul. Golden Gun's mind raced, memories of past victories flickering like ghosts. Each duel he had fought, each outlaw he had bested had taught him a single simple rule: strike first, strike true, and never hesitate. But now, under the cold, judgmental eyes of the old cowboy, that lesson felt dangerously incomplete. Here, the land itself seemed to command respect. The silence seemed to carry wisdom, and even the stars overhead seemed to watch, patient and eternal. Golden Gun realized with a sinking awareness that the duel was no longer about proving his skill. It was about understanding what it meant to survive not just physically, but morally and emotionally in the ruthless expanse of the frontier. The old cowboy shifted slightly, his movements almost imperceptible yet deliberate. His eyes scanned Golden Gun's stance, reading the nervous tension coiled in his shoulders, the flicker of doubt in his hands. There was no mockery in his gaze, only observation, patience, and a subtle, unspoken challenge to rise above impulse, to confront the truth of one's own heart. Golden Gun swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was to meet the kind of duel that did not rely on bullets, but on insight and endurance. A hush settled over the crowd as a single horse pawed at the dirt, nostrils flaring, and the faint clatter of distant wagon wheels echoed against the far-off hills. The old cowboy spoke again, his voice a quiet murmur that carried farther than Golden Gun anticipated. Out here, it ain't just the gun that keeps you alive. It's knowing what to fight for, what to hold on to, and what to let go. You can kill a man with skill, but surviving him, that takes heart. His words were soft, yet each syllable struck with the weight of years spent riding through blizzards, deserts, and bloodied plains. Golden Gun felt the truth of them, bitter and humbling, seep into his bones. The young gunslinger's fingers brushed against the grip of his golden revolver. He could feel the familiar cold metal beneath his calloused skin, the weight of it both comforting and oppressive. He had always believed the gun to be the ultimate measure of power, the solution to every problem, the answer to every challenge. Yet now, as he studied the old cowboy's unwavering posture, he understood the limitation of that belief. Survival demanded more than speed, more than precision. It demanded awareness, patience, and the courage to face one's own fear. And then, as if sensing the tension reaching a climax, a figure emerged from the shadows near the edge of town. A woman, tall and composed, wrapped in a shawl, her face half hidden by the moonlight. Golden Gun's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a sudden, unexpected surge of longing. The old cowboy's eyes flicked toward her briefly, a flicker of recognition passing through the depths of his gaze. It was a quiet reminder that the Wild West was not only a land of guns, duels, and survival, but of fleeting human connections, love found in stolen moments, family forged in hardship, and the fragile hope that life could offer more than death and dust. The woman stepped forward cautiously, her eyes meeting Golden Gun's with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and courage. The crowd barely breathed, sensing that her presence had shifted the energy of the night. Golden Gun realized that this duel was no longer only a test of skill, it was now a test of humanity. The choices he made, the patience he displayed, the respect he offered, would all weigh heavily upon the outcome. And in that instant, he glimpsed the truth the old cowboy had been teaching all along. The heart mattered more than the gun. The wind whispered through the street once more, rustling the edges of worn banners and the dusty hats of the onlookers. The moon, a pale witness to the unfolding scene, cast long shadows that intertwined with the figures of the duelists. Golden Gun adjusted his stance, no longer reckless, no longer solely focused on the weapon in his hand. He began to understand that the duel would be won not by the fastest draw, but by the man who could balance skill with wisdom, courage with patience, and ambition with empathy. And as the first hints of dawn began to brush the edges of the horizon, painting the desert in pale shades of lavender and gold, both men remained poised, silent, tense, and ready. The duel was far from over, yet the first lessons had already been learned. The old cowboy's patience had unsettled the young gunslinger, introduced him to a reality far beyond bullets and bravado, and planted a seed of transformation in the heart of a man who had once believed himself invincible. The townsfolk watched, rapt and silent, knowing that history was being written in that small, dusty street, not in the roar of gunfire, but in the subtle, electric power of patience, respect, and the understanding that the Wild West tested not just skill, but character. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the town, pale and hesitant, spilling gold and gray onto the rough planks of the main street. The chill of night lingered, mingling with the dry heat of the day yet to come, wrapping the town in a tension that felt almost tangible. The old cowboy stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Golden Gun, measuring him, not just the man, but the fire behind his eyes, the restless pulse that had driven him across deserts, mountains, and bloodied plains. There was no rush, no bravado, only a measured patience born of decades surviving the unforgiving West. Each breath he drew seemed to pull the air of the desert into his lungs, a reminder of everything he had endured and learned. Golden Gun shifted, the weight of his golden revolver heavy in his hand, and for the first time he felt the enormity of the lesson he had stumbled into. This duel was not simply about proving skill. It was about understanding consequence, mortality, and the quiet, relentless demands of life on the frontier. His mind raced with memories of past encounters, men he had bested and towns he had left behind. Yet nothing in all his victories had prepared him for the magnitude of standing across from someone who had mastered patience and strength in equal measure. He felt exposed in a way he had never allowed himself to feel. The townsfolk lingered on the edges of the street, their whispers soft and anxious, every eye fixed on the two men. The woman who had appeared the night before remained near the edge of the crowd, her presence a quiet reminder of another world beyond bullets and duels, a world of human connection, fragile hope, and the possibility of love even amidst hardship. Golden Gun found his gaze drifting toward her, and he realized the duel was no longer only a contest of skill. It was a reckoning with his own desires, fears, and the choices that would define the man he was becoming. The old cowboy spoke, his voice carrying across the street with quiet authority. "You've got fire, son. I can see it. But fire alone won't keep you alive. It'll burn fast and leave nothing behind if you don't temper it with patience, wisdom, and the courage to face what you've been running from." His eyes held Golden Gun, searching for comprehension, for acknowledgement that the young man was beginning to see beyond the lure of reputation and gold. Golden Gun felt a stir of humility, a sharp, almost painful awareness that he had been blind in his pursuit of glory, oblivious to the lessons life had been offering him at every turn. As the wind stirred the dust along the street, a sudden movement caught Golden Gun's attention. A rider emerging from the ridge outside of town, kicking up clouds of sand and stone. It was an old friend, a former outlaw who had once fought by his side yet who had chosen a different path, one paved with regret and solitude. The sight of him brought memories flooding back. Nights spent under the stars, the crackling campfire, laughter and fear intertwined. The blood spilled in the name of survival. Golden Gun realized that every choice he had made, every life he had crossed was converging here in this dusty street, with the old cowboy watching, waiting, and teaching. The old cowboy's hand rested lightly near the grip of his revolver, but he made no move. There was no rush. He understood the unspoken truth that the duel was as much about restraint as it was about action. Golden Gun's pulse throbbed in his ears, a drumbeat of tension and anticipation, and he began to recognize that strength in the West was measured not by speed, but by the depth of one's understanding, the courage to face not only one's enemy, but oneself. Golden Gun's thoughts turned again to the woman. Her presence was a balm in the midst of danger, a fragile light against the harsh shadows of the frontier. He realized that the Wild West was not just a place of survival and death, but also of fleeting connections, of love born in the most improbable of circumstances, and of the chance to find meaning in a land that demanded everything and gave little in return. The duel, he now understood, was as much about protecting those he cared for as it was about proving skill. Every heartbeat carried the weight of choices he could no longer ignore. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the distant clang of a bell from the old church at the edge of town, signaling the start of morning service. The sound seemed almost surreal, a reminder that life went on even when the world seemed poised on the knife edge of fate. The old cowboy tilted his head slightly, listening yet never moving, never breaking the spell of patience and quiet authority he had woven around the street. Golden Gun felt the tension crackle anew, the realization settling fully in his chest that this duel would be unlike any he had fought. It was as much a battle of the heart and mind as it was of skill. And then, as the sun broke fully over the horizon, spilling light over rooftops, dusty streets, and the gathered crowd, the old cowboy finally spoke again. "Remember this, son. A man can fire 100 shots and still lose. A man can draw the fastest gun and still die. What keeps you alive out here is knowing what matters and having the courage to fight for it." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that pressed down on Golden Gun's soul, reshaping the young gunslinger in ways that bullets never could. The duel was far from over, but a transformation had already begun. Golden Gun felt it in his bones, in the way the dust seemed to settle differently around him, in the steadiness creeping into his hands, in the new clarity forming behind his eyes. He understood that the old cowboy's surprise had not been a trick, but a lesson, one that would echo through every town, every canyon, every lonely mile of frontier he would ever cross. The townsfolk held their breath, sensing that history was being written not in gunfire but in understanding, patience, and the subtle courage it took to face one's own fears and desires. The woman watched too, her expression unreadable, yet her eyes glimmered with the recognition of a change taking place, a change that might one day lead to trust, connection, and even love amidst the harshness of the West. The sun climbed higher over the jagged mesas surrounding the town, casting harsh shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the dusty main street. The heat was already climbing, wrapping itself around every plank, every weathered face, and every horse tied to the posts outside the saloon. The old cowboy remained where he had been since the first light, his figure calm, unhurried, yet undeniably commanding. Decades of survival had etched patience and quiet authority into his bones. He moved with a precision born of experience, each breath, each shift of weight measured, deliberate. Across from him, Golden Gun's pulse pounded with a rhythm he could no longer ignore. He was acutely aware that the duel was no longer a mere contest. It was a crucible, testing not just skill but wisdom, heart, and the ability to see beyond pride. The streets were alive with tension. Townsfolk had come from surrounding homesteads and ranches, their faces pale and expectant. Some clutched the hands of loved ones. Others leaned against posts or fences, unwilling to turn away. There was a collective understanding in the air. This was not just a duel. It was a story in motion, a life lesson unfolding before their eyes. Even the horses seemed restless, stamping in the dust and flicking tails against flies, sensing the thick, almost electric anxiety that hung over the town. Golden Gun shifted his weight, the cold metal of his golden revolver heavy against his palm. It had always been a symbol of power, a talisman of dominance in every town he had passed through. Yet now it felt like a fragile promise, a weight that reminded him of his own vulnerability. He realized that skill with the gun was not enough. The old cowboy's calm demeanor, his patient stare had unsettled something deep within him. His pride. It was a strange, uncomfortable awakening, one that forced Golden Gun to confront not just the duel, but the man he had been and the man he might become. The old cowboy's voice, low and steady, cut across the heavy silence. You've got fire, and that's good. But fire burns too quick when it's not tempered. It can destroy you and everyone around you if you don't learn when to let it die down. This duel, it ain't just about the gun, son. It's about knowing what's worth surviving for and what's worth giving up. Golden Gun's chest tightened at the words, feeling them like bullets piercing his armor. He had always believed survival meant dominance, strength, and speed, yet he was beginning to understand that it also meant wisdom, restraint, and the courage to see beyond his own ambition. And then, breaking the heavy quiet, a commotion erupted at the edge of town. A man, gaunt, ragged, and clearly desperate, stumbled into view, shouting accusations and pointing a crude pistol. The townsfolk froze, whispers of fear rippling through the crowd. Golden Gun's eyes darted toward the threat, every instinct screaming to draw, to act, to prove himself. But the old cowboy did not flinch. He did not move hastily. Instead, he assessed the man with the calm precision of a predator, reading intent, measuring danger, weighing consequences. In that moment, Golden Gun realized the truth. Survival in the West required more than reflex. It required understanding, patience, and the ability to act decisively without letting anger or fear cloud judgment. The stranger's pistol wavered as he approached, his hands trembling, his voice rising in panic. Golden Gun felt his fingers tighten around his revolver, the familiar urge to fire boiling within him. Yet he paused, studying the old cowboy. The old man's eyes held a calm certainty that spoke louder than any warning. Golden Gun understood instinctively. Acting too soon could escalate violence, but waiting, watching, and understanding could neutralize danger without a single shot fired. It was a lesson in control, a test that reached far beyond the duel itself. The tension thickened as the stranger faltered, sweat running down his face in the morning heat. The old cowboy took a single step forward, his presence alone enough to command attention, and spoke in a voice both firm and measured. Set it down. You're not winning anything here. Walk away before you ruin the rest of your life. The words carried authority, patience, and the kind of quiet power that only came from decades surviving the unforgiving West. Golden Gun watched, spellbound, as the man lowered his weapon slowly, defeated not by bullets but by presence, wisdom, and calm command. The crowd exhaled, realizing the duel had become more than a contest. It had become a masterclass in survival, patience, and moral strength. Golden Gun's thoughts shifted to the woman who had appeared the night before, standing silently among the townsfolk. Her eyes held a quiet intensity, a mixture of concern and understanding, and he felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, protectiveness, longing, and the weight of responsibility. He realized that the duel was not just about proving skill. It was about earning trust, forming bonds, and discovering what truly mattered in a harsh and unforgiving world. Love, respect, and honor were now inseparable from survival. A man could no longer live solely for himself without risking everything he valued. The old cowboy returned his attention to Golden Gun, who now stood with a new awareness. The duel would continue, but something had shifted. The young gunslinger had glimpsed the lessons hidden within patience, restraint, and empathy. The golden revolver felt suddenly heavier in his hand, not because of its metal, but because of the responsibility it represented. The duel was no longer a contest of pride or reputation. It had become a crucible of character, testing courage, heart, and the choices that defined a man in the unforgiving landscape of the West. And as the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the lingering shadows of night, both men remained poised, silent, tense, yet profoundly changed. The old cowboy's surprise had not been a trick, nor a mere test of skill. It had been a revelation, a glimpse of the wisdom, patience, and moral courage required to survive the Wild West, to protect what mattered, and to face the consequences of every action. Golden Gun understood now that the duel was far from over, but the lessons he had learned would shape him in ways bullets never could. The townsfolk watched in awe, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and profound. Not just a duel, but the birth of a transformation, a story that would echo through the canyon walls, across dusty trails, and into the hearts of every soul who called the frontier home. The sun had climbed to its zenith, scorching the wooden planks of the main street and sending heat waves dancing above the dust. Every shadow had shrunk to a thin line beneath the weathered buildings. Yet the tension in the town stretched tighter than the noon sky. The old cowboy stood firm, unshaken by the blistering sun or the weight of expectation pressing from the crowd. He had waited for decades in moments like this, reading men's intentions, weighing the cost of every action, and knowing that the land itself had a way of revealing truth to those willing to observe. His eyes, steady and unwavering, measured Golden Gun with a patience that bordered on serenity, yet carried a quiet storm of authority beneath the surface. Golden Gun's hands were clammy around the golden revolver, the weight of it suddenly heavier than it had ever been. Pride, ambition, and the lure of glory still whispered in his mind. Yet they were overpowered by a new awareness. Survival and honor were inseparable, and choices could carve the difference between life and death. The young gunslinger's chest tightened as he realized that every step he had taken, every duel he had fought, and every town he had passed through had led to this moment, not to prove dominance, but to understand responsibility, restraint, and the courage to confront the consequences of one's actions. The crowd, now motionless, held its collective breath. Mothers clutched children to their chests. Fathers leaned against posts, and the woman from the night before stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Golden Gun with a mixture of fear, admiration, and something warmer, something that hinted at hope, trust, and the fragile possibility of love amidst the chaos of the West. The young gunslinger's gaze met hers for a heartbeat too long, and he felt the stirrings of something deeper than the thrill of a duel, a desire to protect, to connect, to be more than the sum of his reputation and his skill with a gun. The old cowboy finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying a weight that pressed into Golden Gun's very soul. "You've learned a lot to get here, son. Fire alone won't keep you alive. Skill alone won't make a man. You've got courage. But the West demands more than courage. It demands heart, patience, and the willingness to face what you've been running from. It's time to prove whether you understand that or if you'll walk away believing this duel is only about bullets and pride." Golden Gun's pulse raced, yet he did not move impulsively. He recalled the stranger from the day before, lowered not by gunfire but by calm authority. He remembered the lessons of patience, observation, and the quiet power of choosing when to act. And most of all, he remembered the woman, her presence a reminder that life, fragile as it was in the Wild West, carried meaning beyond survival. The old cowboy took a single step forward, his shadow stretching long across the street. Golden Gun mirrored him, measuring the distance, feeling every heartbeat as if it were a drum summoning the fates. The townsfolk, silent and rapt, felt the moment thrum like a living thing, aware that history was being written in dust and sunlight, in courage and restraint, in choices that could shape the destiny of more than just two men. And then, without warning, a movement flickered at the edge of Golden Gun's vision, a horse bolting from the ridge, a thief attempting to escape with stolen supplies from the general store. Instinct screamed at him to fire, to act, to assert dominance. But the lessons of the old cowboy, the lessons of restraint and wisdom, held him back. He took a slow breath, observed the situation, and instead of shooting impulsively, he stepped into a position that cut off the thief without violence. The old cowboy's lips curved in a faint, approving smile. Action without haste, courage without recklessness. This was the true test of the duel, and Golden Gun had passed it. Time seemed to stretch and fold, the sun climbing higher, yet the tension never breaking. The duel, the contest that had drawn the town together, that had tested skill, patience, and heart, had transformed into a moment of revelation. Golden Gun understood now that the old cowboy's surprise had never been a trick. It had been a lesson in morality, wisdom, and the human heart, the kind of lesson that left a man alive, humbled and forever changed. The woman stepped forward, approaching Golden Gun slowly, her gaze softening, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out. Golden Gun lowered his revolver completely, the weight lifting from his hand as he took her hand in his. In that touch was reassurance, connection, and a fragile promise that life could be more than duels, dust, and danger. The old cowboy watched, eyes crinkling at the edges with a rare, approving warmth. This was the reward of patience, restraint, and living by a code deeper than bullets and bravado. Finally, the old cowboy nodded to Golden Gun. "You've survived, son. Not because of speed or skill, but because you learned what matters. Remember that. The West will test you every day, but it won't forgive arrogance, impatience, or cruelty. Survive with heart, and you'll live to see more than just dust and blood. You'll see life worth living." Golden Gun lowered his head respectfully, a humbling mix of pride and gratitude washing over him. He understood now that survival was not merely about drawing first or shooting faster. It was about choices, patience, and heart. He looked at the woman, at the townsfolk, at the old cowboy, and felt a new sense of purpose settle into his chest like a steady drumbeat. He was no longer just a gunslinger seeking reputation. He was a man capable of understanding, protecting, and building something beyond mere survival. As the town exhaled collectively, as dust settled, horses stamped quietly, and the wind stirred the sage along the edges of town, a sense of quiet triumph lingered in the air. Golden Gun holstered his golden revolver, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a reminder of the lessons he had learned. Patience, restraint, courage, and the capacity for connection, even in a world built on bullets and hardship. The old cowboy tipped his hat, a gesture of acknowledgement and approval, and for the first time Golden Gun understood what it truly meant to survive and to live in the Wild West.